So the topic for today, it's more into highlights on what's coming in 47.1. I will be honest with you, I studied this type of presentations since February. We're expecting the standard to come out in May. There's a delay process, still not up. Hopefully in October we're gonna get an edition. The only reason for the delay is they wanted to publish French and English edition at the same time. It is the first time CSA is trying to do this, and I guess it's a good thing. We have to wait for a couple of months. So here's the agenda. I thought I'll start to explain you the way the technical committee of CSA W47.1 actually works. Not everybody is involved in standards activities. And every single time I will go through the presentation, I'll try to make comparison with other committees or other standards or how people do similar things in the world. Then we're going to move into the robotic provisions requirements. Everything you see, with the exception of the last bullet, they're new things. Robotic provisions, welding a thin material, 3 millimeters and less, welding of stainless steel, welding for the marine sector, which is brand new, and I'll give you some background on that one as well. And then I'll tell you the changes that will come for the impact testing and for hardness. So the Canadian Standards Association actually, in order to publish standards, they need an accreditation from Standards Council of Canada. I use a lot of acronyms, SCC, to become a standard development organization. Similar in the world is the same for ISO, for AWS, for ASME, and so forth. The first edition of W47.1, and you're probably going to see the connection right now, it came out in 1947. So W stands for welding. 47 is the first year when they published the edition. 0.1 means steel, 0.2 means aluminum, and so forth. The 2019 edition would be the 7th edition of 47.1. If you'd have to go back in 1947 to see the first certification program they came up with, it's just a small brochure. A couple of pages in there, they were telling the fabricators they have to test their welders and get into welding procedures. The goal of every single edition, and the main goal of the technical committee, is to make sure they update the standard to pick up with the industry needs and also have a good standard. We all know the standards are good as long as we can work with them. But when you have difficulties understanding the standard, we do not like the standards anymore. So the technical committee of CSA W47.1 is formed based on a matrix established by CSA. They have a very well established matrix, and they try to get people that actually service within a sector. So in this particular case, around the table, I believe there are about 28 members at this time. You'll have representatives from the welding fabricators, inspectors, engineers, building officials, because they do work with the standard, and welding educators. The CWB, as an administrator of the standard, it does attend the meetings, but they don't have the right to vote. We are just an associate. Let's move into robotic provisions. The current edition doesn't say anything robotic. We may interpret the word automatic as being robotic. However, the technical committee felt that we should be more specific in developing provisions for robotic welding. So the next edition will have clear definitions of robotic welding and clear messages and specifications for testing the welding personnel and procedures. As you see in there, welding supervisor will not, all the active welding supervisors today will not be required to pass any exam. For new companies and new supervisors that will apply will have to transition into this new rule. However, those existing certified welding or qualified welding supervisors, in time, through a transition plan, they will have to demonstrate they have knowledge about robotic welding if they use it in the shop, of course. No exam would be required for the existing one, as I said. Then we have two new provisions, and those apply for the robotic programmer and robotic operator. And you'll see it here, and I'll try to provide you with a background of some of the meanings in there. The first bullet for the programmer says, no testing is required for the programmer. There is no way we can test someone from Panasonic, for example, that shipped the program or sold the program to the company. It would be up to the company to implement that program and make sure they have proper qualification for the operators. However, if the company does program the robot by themselves, they have their own software, would be the person that actually does that would be required to pass the test. And the test required, it's a standard test assembly. You will see a new figure in 47.1, and I believe it's figure 36. It is very similar with what you would see, for example, in close to what you would see in AWS D16 standard. It's a combination of a horizontal plate with a vertical plate, by the end with a tube. So they have to program the robot to weld on both sides with intermittent fillet weld, with a complete penetration from one side and intermittent around the tube. That would be the standard test assembly. The same standard test assembly would be required for the operators, which would like to get a transferable qualification. However, if the standard test assembly, like we have all the other figures, 8 and 9 of 47.1, are not applicable for production, the company would be allowed to develop those alternate test assemblies. For example, if they have about 10 or 15 products where they weld in different welding positions with these robots, and they can match those into a single welding procedure or two alternates, that would be acceptable. For example, if they do only fillet weld in different welding positions, a fillet weld, they can use the production test assembly. We're going to cut it, macro edges, and measure the sizes of the weld. What is interesting, and actually it's different from what actually the operator test says in 47.1, the technical committee thought very seriously in retesting every 2 years, which is very unique. Most of the time we believe an operator would hit the button and that's it. Because it's a new process, if you want to take it this way in 47.1, they consider that a retest every 2 years would be required for those transferable qualifications. Welding procedures. Those using robots will have to test their welding procedures if applicable. Pre-qualified joints will continue to apply as long as all the other essential variables are being met. When they will have to test the procedures, we always try to use the standard test assemblies. But we do understand in some scenarios the company may need to program that robot. So we'll be, from case to case, we have to analyze that and see if they can weld the standard test assemblies or they can do the production test assembly. When they do the production test assembly, we have to think and stay as close as possible with the test specimens that are being required to be extracted from the standard assemblies. For example, if it's a fillet weld, we're going to come up with a test for macro edges and fracture. In addition to the essential variables of Table 11, 47.1, the technical committee wanted to have some specific essential variables for robotic. The brand name of the robot, the program ID or name, the type of sensor. However, what you see in italic there, it says, if the same framework of essential variables can be replicated, those no additional test is required, which means those 3 bullet points that you see in there for the essential variables would not apply. So let's think of the practical one. One of the essential variables for MIG, which is mainly used for robots, would be spray transfer mode. So if they can replicate that, there's no test required. Changing sensors, small additions, those will not be considered essential variables. What is interesting is that a test conducted with a semi-automatic process will be recognized for robotic welding as well. So there were committee members that strongly believe, and they know because they use robots, these are experts in robots, they can replicate the same essential variables on a robot, whatever was tested or was used for semi-automatic. So these are the main changes with respect to robotic welding. The next one deals with the welding of thin materials, also known 3 millimeters and below. As you probably know, currently, W47.1 standard does not have any provisions. They reference an American standard, which is AWS D1.3. It worked very good. But there are some issues when you combine different standards. You have to match more conditions. So the technical committee thought and strongly believed that having provisions for welding of thin materials in 47.1 would actually help the fabricator test less. And I'll give you an example. For welding procedures, in Canada we're using CSA materials. If you have to move to D1.3, those steels are not listed, which means you'd have to qualify a procedure, although that procedure might be pre-qualified. So what you would see in here, the next 3 annexes will supplement the body of the standard, which means from clause 1 to 9 will apply the same. Only provides you with provisions for personnel qualification and for procedures. Once the standard gets published and 47.1 would be required by the project, everything is 3 millimeters and below would require to comply with this annex. What is interesting, what you see on the last bulletin there, you will see in this Annex J tables with matching filler metal to the base materials, which is mostly common for W59, not for 47.1. But you'll also see a clause in there that permits the welding engineer to consider a material equivalent which is not listed in the standard. Simply chemistry, carbon equivalent, mechanical properties. So that will help the fabricator test less. Let's talk about welding procedure and qualifications. We'll continue to permit pre-qualification for procedures. You see very similar pre-qualified joints, similar to what you see in D1.3. So when they try to build up, what I like to remind you, when they try to develop these annexes, they wanted to do it that way that the industry will not suffer. It would be an easy transition from the existing approach to the new annexes. We do not want to see the fabricators testing more. Sometimes testing might not going to tell you anything. So we have to think in advance how we transition the existing approved welding procedures into the new annex, existing welder qualification into the new annexes. So that was a very heavy thought, but the technical committee and the CWB looked into that. So it specifies base metals and matching filler, like I said. They have their own test assemblies for both, for welder qualification and for procedures. They will comply with what we actually do today. 2 small test assemblies for each welder qualification, for example. They have their own ranges, which is very much in line with what we do today, and they have their own specific essential variables, which means you don't have to go to table 11 to apply those essential variables. You'll look up in Annex J, and you'll have that. They have their own figures and their own test assemblies, as I mentioned. Welding personnel qualification. It is very interesting because it would be very easy to identify the qualification obtained in accordance with this annex. You will see after the class, we're using the class T, S, F, W, and WT, you'll see a dash G. G stands for the gauge material. What is interesting in there, it's a T, which means the welders can perform testing on tubular thin materials as well. We'll continue to have a simplified matrix for welding positions. As you probably know, 47.1 is the most stringent in the world with respect to welding positions, and that retesting every 2 years. But what the industry has done so far, they have a simplified matrix of testing. For example, if they do vertical and overhead, will obtain all positions qualification. It does permit testing, and is very interesting, on standard test assembly and alternates. For example, in AWS D1.3, you only have standard test assemblies. I go back to the same idea. Sometimes the standard test assembly might not be applicable for the type of production they do. They can develop those alternates, and they can reduce the testing. With an alternate testing, as you probably know, they will obtain a non-transferable qualification, so the welder is kind of locked into that procedure with limitation with respect to the thickness, welding positions, and many other variables. We'll continue to have check testing every 2 years. You probably know that actually 47.1 standard allows exemption from testing. But I can tell you that not even 1%, less than 0.1% of the fabricators ever want to have exemption. They want to retest every 2 years. It's a 45 minutes test. As you probably know, the check testing, it's actually less testing than the initial test. They prefer to test the welder. We'll continue to have 2 test assemblies for most of the joints. I believe just arc seam and arc plug will have just 1 joint. The rest, like fillet weld, butt joints, they'll have 2 test assemblies. They'll have their own figures with dimensions and what is required. We'll continue to have indefinite qualification for the welding operators, like the body of the standard. Welding of stainless steel. I apologize for the first bullet. There's an error in there. I mentioned W59 references D16. Actually, 47.1 references D16 as well. So currently, 47.1 does not have any provisions for testing of stainless steel. They're using another standard, which is AWS D1.6 standard, but they translated this annex to the language and the approach that we do in 47.1. So when 47.1 would be selected for use as a governing standard, this Annex K will take precedence. Similar to Annex J, it supplements all the other clauses from 1 to 9. So basically, it provides with the provisions for personnel qualification, for procedures qualification. Has been developed, again, to be in line with what approach we have right now, not to create any headaches for the fabricators. And again, they will have, this Annex K would have its own table with matching filler metals and base materials, and also permits the welding engineer to take a decision and considering a material not listed there being equivalent with any listed material, which in my opinion makes sense regardless where we buy the steel from. We're looking for chemistry, carbon equivalent, and mechanical properties, regardless if it's EN or Japanese or so forth. There's no reason to test that steel because it's not published in the standard. Welding procedure qualifications. They will have pre-qualified joints. All these pre-qualified joints that will be acceptable are actually in CSA W47.1. All the figures you have in clause 10. Every single one will be considered pre-qualified as long as they match the filler method to the base material, appropriate welding positions, and so forth. I mentioned about the matching filler to the base material. They have their own type of joints, their own test assemblies would be for welder qualification and for procedure qualifications. Different thickness ranges. Actually, for stainless steel, for 3 mm and above would be similar to what you have, but you'll see. It's very interesting because it's new on the market, I would say. No other code has. It will permit welding of stainless steel less than 3 mm. When they weld 3 mm and less, actually Annex K directs the reader to Annex J, which means the same pre-qualified joints would apply for stainless steel and the same type of testing. It is new. In today's world, we actually have no provisions than using a standard AWSD 9.1, which requires testing for everything. So pre-qualified joints would apply. There's no reason why thin stainless steel won't work similar with respect to pre-qualified joints, similar to carbon steel. The logic for welding personnel qualification would be maintained, which is more stringent. All 4 positions are required. Check testing is simplified. For example, if someone has 4 positions for a check test every 2 years that is required, they can do only 1 plate, vertical up on a fillet weld, and then move the plate on the overhead and complete that weld. Welding operators will continue to have indefinite qualifications as long as they're involved in welding every 6 months and they don't go outside of the essential variables. And what is interesting, just to make it easier and more cost efficient for the fabricators, testing on a carbon steel material is permitted with stainless steel filler, whatever can be applicable. And that will help a lot, regardless if it's a 3 mm and above or 3 mm and below. And from my own experience, I can tell you the fabricators really like that. It's way more cost efficient. Okay, let's move into the marine annex. This is brand new. And you would ask yourself, why would we need a marine annex? Well, it did create a lot of headaches in the last few years. As you probably know, the government is financing a lot of projects in today's world that are being built either out east or out west. All these big shipyards have been certified with the CWB to the CSA W47.1 forever. Suddenly, the government has taken off their hands from the projects and they landed the class societies. So it's up to the class society to decide what codes and specs are being used. That actually created a lot of headache for the fabricators, for the shipyards, because everything was approved and accepted in the past is no longer good. There's no pre-qualified joints accepted. They have to redo the test, all the procedures retested, and so forth. So with that said, the technical committee actually formed a technical group within this committee that came from the marine industry, from all the big shipyards, and from the government as well. The whole idea was to develop this marine annex that will help the industry, but also satisfy the class societies. So what they have done, they actually did comparison between a lot of class society specs and the IACS unified rule. IACS is an association of class societies. There are about 12, I think, within. And what they've done, they have these specs, they call them unified rules, that have to be followed at minimum by every single class society. I can tell you from my experience, they deviate each class societies. We started to have a lot of meetings. Michelle and I met with a lot of class societies and the government bodies. It seems to be a very positive approach to the new Marine Annex. We will continue to make very detailed presentation for the class societies and surveyors because they have a call, they have a say for everything, just to make sure we help the fabricator to have a single certification that will meet everybody's requirements, not to test that procedure on every single project and over again. We all know that a procedure testing cost the shipyards a lot of money. It's not just the procedure itself, it's the standby of the welders. You have tens or hundreds of welders sometimes sitting in there doing nothing, just fitting. That costs a lot of money. This marine annex will supplement 47.1, which means supervisor engineers will follow the same rules, everything from clause 1 to 9. But it does have provisions for welders qualification and for procedures qualification. Another thing to bear in mind was that this technical group wanted to develop this annex also to meet and exceed the body of the 47.1 standard, which means if a welder gets qualified according to this Annex M or qualifies a procedure in accordance to this Annex M, would be recognized as a good qualification for the regular 47.1. Would be up to the employer when they transfer qualification from one to one to decide if they want to retest the welder or not. So this new annex will list specific materials which are for the shipyard, for the shipbuilding industry. The companies that get certified in accordance to this annex or transition into this new annex, because it will be permitted, which means they will test their personnel and procedure, they will have a special identification, -M. If you worked with 47.1 for a long time, you can call back in, by the end of 80s or 90s, 47.1 used to have a supplement that was used for qualification of welding procedures and personnel for offshore projects. In that time, we used to have an S assigned for the 47.1 companies certified with that. Why we thought about this -M will help the surveyor to understand that actually welders have been qualified and company qualified procedure in accordance with this annex. The electrodes will continue to be certified by the CWB to the applicable CSA W48 standard or A5 series, or at a surveyor decision, we can certify the electrodes in accordance to the IACS Unified Rules 17. Welding procedures and their qualifications. So what you see on the first bullet, it actually tells you that it departs from the approach of 47.1. It does not permit pre-qualification, and that's very unique. And the reason the technical group decided to do that is to be in line with what the class societies actually do. They do not accept pre-qualified joints. They want to test the joints. It requires more testing. And that's why, as I said earlier, a procedure tested to Annex M would be recognized for 47.1. So you'll have mandatory testing like RT or UT. You're going to have LT, MT, CVN, and hardness. And I'll go through the CVN. You'll see very harsh requirements. They have a more complex matrix for testing. They're using some letters in there, with backing, without backing, with back gouging. So based on the type of joint they will do, the company will have to test accordingly. I would assume the shipyards and the fabricator will choose the hardest one just to qualify for everything. It makes sense. There's no reason to test twice. They have separate qualification ranges, which are very much in line with the IACS rules. And they also have separate type of qualifications for fillet weld. As you probably know, we go by the leg size in 47.1 and 59 when we measure them. But the class societies have the ASME approach or the ISO approach, if you want to take it this way, and they go by the single and multipass and by the throat. They measure the throat. And you'll see that in there. They have their own unique essential variables. It's exactly what the IACS rules. They're more harsh, if you want to take it this way, than the regular Table 11. That would not apply for this. They have their own figures for the test assemblies. You'll see larger size or longer size, if you want to take it this way. And they have identified how to extract the CVN, what type of test is required. They're very unique. They specify separate energy for the CVN testing. So in the IACS or the class societies rules, they have different values for the energy, different temperatures for testing based on the type of base material they test, if the process is manual, semi-automatic, or automatic, and they have special condition for submerge. It's very complex, but a technical group thought it should be a mirror of what's in IACS to make sure you test once, and that's good for life. Qualification in one position qualifies for all positions, for that position only. However, they have the approach of other codes, like the Breach Code, for example, or ASME. If they want to obtain all positions, they have to qualify for the lowest high heat input and highest heat input. So it would be 3G for the highest and either 1G, 2G, or 4G for the lowest heat input. Personnel. As I mentioned, The company will have that identification with -M, would be similar for the welders. They will have T-M, S-M, FW-M. That will help the surveyor to understand that they use different approach for testing. They'll follow the same logic for the welding positions, which is the most stringent in the world. All 4 positions, not simplified. It does permit testing on the standard test assemblies, unlike sheet steel, regular steel, or stainless steel that permits alternate. This annex wants to test the welders only in the standard test assembly. That's the specification they put in, just to be in line with what class societies are doing today. If you're familiar with figure 8 and 9, which are figures for the test assemblies for welders qualification, the technical group has developed similar test assemblies, but they only got option 1 and option 2, or option 3 from figure 8, which would be a single bevel on toe backing or the open root V-groove. Those are very specific for the shipyards, so they want to test only for those type of for those type of joints. Look at that. They have different test assemblies for the tack welders, a separate one for fillet weld and a separate one for butt weld. And they will follow the same complex matrix for the joints. It doesn't mean that they're going to test to A, B, C, D. They do one of those joints, but they have to select the proper joint in order to meet the procedure qualification that they actually have done. They have to look into if they use any back gouging or a backing bar would be enough, and so forth. Check testing required to be performed every 2 years. Remember, the check testing is allowed 90 days before the expiry date and 90 days after the expiry date. 90 days after doesn't mean the welder is still qualified. It gets a break for that. So when the expiry date comes, they are no longer qualified. No retest will be required for the welding operators, so it'll be in line with what the industry does and all the standards are calling up for. And the last bullet is very important. The surveyor can make a call at any time with respect to the welding procedure or the welder qualification. For example, if the welder gets qualified, gets the ticket, goes out there, does a crappy work, when the surveyor walks in the shipyard, he can recall the qualification and tell the welder that he has to pass a new test. The technical group wanted to have this approach because that's the way the class society does it. They want to satisfy their conditions. Okay, in the next slide, I will talk about the impact and hardness. We all know that Annex E and Annex G, it did create a lot of headaches for some of the engineers and fabricators. It was unclear what gets approved, what doesn't get approved. It was more testing. So we looked into refining, if you want to take it this way, these 2 annexes, and we wanted to bring it in line with what other codes are doing and make it easier for the fabricator and stop retesting so much. So the first change you will see there would be in the general requirements. What actually the change would say is that when 47.1 and another governing code, for example, the 1.5 code, requires impact testing, less testing would be acceptable. The governing code can rule. So for example, if 47.1 would call up for heat-affected zone and weld metal, and D1.5 calls up for some projects, for some application, only for weld metal, the company is not required to do heat-affected zone impact. And that came with requests from the bridge industry. Would be a better clarity with respect to the qualification ranges. So you will see in that table E2, very well identified that 3G qualifies for all positions, and also what 1G qualifies for, 2G qualifies for, 1F, 2F. It was kind of unclear in there. Interesting, qualification ranges for base materials. You would see examples of base materials to make it very clear what gets approved based on what test is performed. And they also recommend the type of testing. We all know that some of the MTRs do not provide you with information with respect to the CVN testing or hardness, so you have to select the proper material for that and match it with the filler metal. The next bullet may create some controversy, the different engineers around the room, but what the technical committee wanted to do it, make it more easier with respect to qualification ranges for testing temperature. And I will provide with an example. If you would have to test a PQR for a 350 WT category 3, which means 27 joules at minus 30 Celsius, with a proper filler metal, you qualify that procedure. On the next project, you have to meet category 2, which would be 27 at minus 20, you can use the welding parameters and essential variables developed in the previous PQR because it's considered to be a milder condition. Condition that you have the proper fill of metal to meet the base material with respect to the CVN and mechanical properties. So this way the companies will test less. You're also going to have some clarification with respect to qualification ranges for heat input based on the position. So basically in the table E2, you'll see very clear statements. I know it was confusing in the past. Hardness testing. I'll be honest with you, we don't do much hardness testing with 47.1 unless we have special projects like Hebron, Hibernia, Husky. Then you try to combine 47.1 and other specs because the engineers like to throw all the standards in the world in there. They're using consulting companies from across the world. They don't know how 47.1 would work against ASME or AWS. And unfortunately, the companies end up testing more because we have to meet the most stringent in all the codes and all the requirements. And it's unfair for the fabricator. That's why, going back to your presentation, we deal with this problem through an RFIs. We try to help the fabricators as much as we can. So hardness testing, what you'll see in there, a lot of revision with respect on how to extract the samples, specimens, is very much in line with the applicable ASTM standard. Can't remember the number. I think it's E95. That's why you'll see a revised test method. It's only Vickers. There's nothing about Brinell in there, as far as I remember. There's clarification with respect to testing positions. For example, all positions requires testing for the lowest heat input. And also you'll see a new essential variable with respect to increase in base material tensile strength to be considered an essential variable and would require a new testing. So, as I said, initially this new edition was scheduled to be published in May 2019. I mentioned they want to have English and French versions at the same time. We're getting very close. It's hard when it comes down to translation because you really need technical people that understand welding terminology. And we're lucky right now because around the technical committee we have engineers that are actually based out in Quebec. They work for Quebec companies and they volunteer to help a lot CSA. There's a lot of back and forth. Once the standard gets published, we will communicate this very clear to all welding fabricators and to all customers a transition plan. We always have a transition plan when a new edition comes out. We allow the fabricators to prepare for the new edition and transition very smoothly within these new requirements. We usually give them, I believe, 1 year. I can't remember top of my head right now. This communication will be published on our website as well. It will be a technical document that will be published there. All our personnel will receive new training to the new edition, and we'll let the fabricators know when this gets into effect. The CWB is also working very hard into the transition to the new Annex J and K. We don't want the fabricators to suffer because there's a new code out there and they have to retest. We have to recognize the welding procedures that have been accepted, and as you probably know, we grandfather those regardless of the changes in the standard, but we want to help them to transition into the new requirements. The same for welder qualification. I don't want to see a welder that had 4 positions to 47.1 and D16 and now moving to the Annex K to retest all 4 plates. That would be unfair, so we're looking into a check test. We will continue to offer AWS qualification at the customer request, and as you probably know, there are a lot of welding fabricators. Both sides of the border, they work on projects. Canadians working for American projects, American working for Canadian projects. So we'll continue to offer that service with respect to welding procedures and personnel qualification. And what is very important, no new certification is required for existing certified clients. That is very clear. New applicants will apply to the new conditions and will have to go through the same certification process regardless of the location, at their location, either overseas or here.